My name is Aurelia, and I am 26 years old. Last Thursday evening shattered every illusion I held about my family when my parents announced at dinner that they were giving my sister Natasha a $450,000 downtown property as an early inheritance gift while sliding me a $25 restaurant gift card. The betrayal stung deeper than the obvious favoritism. What they did not know was that I had been investigating our family finances for months, and I was about to expose a decade-long scheme that would destroy their perfect reputation forever. Before we dive into how I unraveled 20 years of lies and served justice colder than our abandoned dinner, I need to know, are you watching this alone tonight? If family drama and revenge stories make your heart race like mine does, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story of betrayal and karma will have you questioning everyone you trust. You definitely want to stick around for what happens next. The Meridian Steakhouse felt like a mausoleum as my parents sat across from Natasha and me, their faces radiating smug satisfaction. My father cleared his throat importantly, as if he were about to deliver the State of the Union address instead of ruining his daughter's faith in family forever. "Girls, your mother and I have been discussing our financial planning," he began, his tone dripping with false gravitas. "We believe it is time to start distributing some assets early, rather than waiting for our eventual passing." My stomach twisted with a mixture of hope and dread. For months I had been struggling to afford my graduate school tuition while working 2 part-time jobs and living in a studio apartment with a broken heating system. The thought that my parents might finally acknowledge my financial struggles sent a wave of relief through my chest. "Natasha," my mother continued, pulling out an elegant envelope sealed with their monogrammed stickers, "we are transferring ownership of the downtown property on 5th Avenue to you effective immediately." I watched in stunned silence as Natasha opened the envelope with trembling fingers, her eyes widening as she processed the legal documents inside. The property they were gifting her was a pristine 3-bedroom townhouse in the most desirable neighborhood in our city, complete with a private garage and rooftop terrace. I had driven past it countless times, admiring its beautiful architecture and prime location. "The property is valued at approximately $450,000, my father announced proudly, as if he were revealing the winner of a lottery. "We thought you could use it as either a rental investment or your future family home." Natasha squealed with delight, throwing her arms around both parents in an emotional embrace. "This is incredible. I cannot believe you are doing this for me. This changes everything about my future plans." My hands gripped my water glass so tightly I feared it might shatter. The rational part of my brain screamed that my turn was coming, that surely my parents had not invited me to this dinner just to watch them shower my sister with generosity while I received nothing. Then my mother turned to me with a smile that I would later recognize as patronizing and cruel. "And Aurelia, we have something special for you too." She handed me a small gift card in a plastic sleeve, the kind you might pick up at a grocery store checkout counter. I stared at the card in disbelief. $25 to Romano's Italian Bistro, a mid-tier chain restaurant where the portions were small and the service was mediocre. The same amount of money I might spend on lunch without thinking twice. "We know how much you enjoy trying new restaurants," my mother said cheerfully, as if she had just presented me with the crown jewels. "This should give you a nice evening out." The contrast was so stark, so brutally unequal, that I wondered if I was experiencing some kind of vivid nightmare. $450,000 versus $25. A life-changing property versus a single meal at a mediocre restaurant. "Are you serious right now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The entire restaurant seemed to fade into background noise as my family's faces came into sharp focus. "Aurelia, do not be ungrateful," my father said sternly. "We are not obligated to give you anything. This is a gift, not an entitlement." "But Natasha gets nearly $500,000, and I get a restaurant gift card. How is that even remotely fair or reasonable?" My sister, still clutching her property deed, looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Aurelia, you have always been so dramatic about money. Mom and Dad have supported you plenty over the years. Maybe if you had made better life choices, you would be in a different position." That comment hit me like a physical blow. Better life choices. I had graduated summa cum laude from college, maintained a perfect academic record through graduate school, volunteered extensively in my community, and worked multiple jobs to support myself financially. Meanwhile, Natasha had barely graduated college, changed majors 4 times, and had been financially supported by our parents well into her 20s. What better choices should I have made exactly? I demanded, feeling my composure beginning to crack. Well, for starters, my mother interjected smoothly, you could have chosen a more practical career path instead of pursuing expensive graduate education that may never pay for itself. Natasha has been responsible with her choices and demonstrated financial maturity. I stared at them in absolute bewilderment. Natasha's idea of financial maturity was spending $300 on a handbag while living rent-free in our parents' basement. Her most recent job had lasted exactly 6 weeks before she quit because her manager was too demanding. But something in their coordinated responses felt rehearsed, almost scripted. The way they spoke about my choices, about fairness, about obligation, it all sounded like they had practiced these justifications beforehand. That night, I drove home in a daze, the gift card burning in my pocket like evidence of my family's contempt. I sat in my cramped apartment, surrounded by textbooks and unpaid bills, trying to process what had just occurred. But as the initial shock wore off, something else took its place, a cold, calculating anger that demanded action rather than tears. I opened my laptop and began researching property records, inheritance laws, and family trust documentation. If my parents could plan their favoritism so meticulously, I could investigate their financial history just as thoroughly. What I discovered over the following weeks would make their restaurant gift card seem like the least of their sins. The next morning I woke up with crystal clarity about my situation. The hurt and shock from the previous evening had crystallized into something much more dangerous: methodical determination. If my parents wanted to play financial games with their children's futures, I was going to learn the rules and play to win. My first stop was the county courthouse, where property records and inheritance documents were matters of public record. I spent 3 hours poring over files, cross-referencing names and dates, building a timeline of my family's financial transactions over the past decade. What I found made my blood run cold. The downtown property they had just given to Natasha was not originally my parents' to give. According to the documentation, it had been purchased 18 months earlier, using funds from a family trust established by my late grandmother, specifically for her grandchildren's education and major life milestones. My grandmother, who had passed away 4 years earlier, had been a shrewd businesswoman who built a small empire of rental properties and investments. Her will clearly stated that the trust fund was to be divided equally between all her grandchildren for education, first homes, or business ventures. I was supposed to receive 1/3 of that trust fund. Natasha was supposed to receive 1/3. Our cousin Marcus, my uncle's son, was supposed to receive the remaining third. Instead, according to the bank records I was able to access through careful inquiries, my parents had somehow gained control of the entire trust and had been using the money as their personal investment fund for years. The property given to Natasha represented my entire portion of the inheritance, plus a significant chunk of what should have belonged to Marcus. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot, hands shaking as I held the photocopied documents that proved my family had stolen my inheritance and given it to my sister as if it were their own generous gift. But I needed more than documentation. I needed allies who could corroborate the theft and help me understand the full scope of the deception. My first call was to Marcus, my cousin, who lived across the country and had limited contact with our extended family since his father's death 2 years earlier. Marcus was a software engineer with a sharp mind and no patience for family drama, which made him the perfect person to approach with facts rather than emotions. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I began when he answered my call. "Shoot. You know I do not sugarcoat anything. Did Grandma ever mention leaving money for your education or future investments, like a trust fund or inheritance, specifically for the grandchildren?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was tight with suppressed anger. She did more than mention it, Aurelia. She sat me down during my senior year of high school and explicitly told me there would be money available for college and for buying my first home. She said she had set up a trust to make sure all her grandchildren had opportunities she never had. Did you ever receive any money from that trust? No. When I asked my dad about it after she died, he said the estate was complicated and that Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia were handling everything. He told me to be patient and that everything would be sorted out eventually. Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia, my parents. Marcus, I think we need to have a longer conversation about our family's financial arrangements. I spent the next 2 hours explaining everything I had discovered, walking Marcus through the property records, the trust documentation, and the timeline of events leading up to Natasha's gift. By the end of our conversation, Marcus was furious. So you are telling me that not only did they steal your inheritance, but they also stole mine and used our money to buy a property that they then gave to Natasha as if they were being generous parents. That is exactly what I am telling you. Aurelia, this is fraud. This is serious criminal fraud. We need to contact an attorney immediately. But I had a different plan in mind. Legal action would take years and cost money I did not have. What I wanted was something much more immediate and personally satisfying. Marcus, before we involve lawyers, I want to try a different approach. I want to confront them publicly and force them to admit what they have done. What did you have in mind? I want to record them confessing to the theft, and then I want to share that recording with every single member of our extended family, so that everyone knows exactly what kind of people they really are. Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. You know what? I am absolutely on board with that plan. These people destroyed my father's relationship with his own mother's legacy, and they have been lying to our entire family for years. They deserve whatever humiliation they get. My second ally came from an unexpected source, Natasha's best friend Carmen, who had been present during several family conversations about finances over the years. Carmen worked as a paralegal and had always been suspicious of the way my parents discussed money and inheritance. Aurelia, I have been waiting for someone to ask these questions for years, Carmen told me when I reached out to her. The numbers never added up. Your parents would talk about being financially stretched, but then they would make major purchases or investments that seemed way beyond their means. Did Natasha ever mention where the money for her property came from? She told me your parents had been saving for years to give her a head start in life, but that never made sense to me. Your father is a middle manager and your mother works part-time. How do they save $450,000 while also supporting 2 adult children and maintaining their own lifestyle? Carmen agreed to help me gather information and documentation. She also revealed that Natasha had been bragging about the property for weeks before the dinner, which meant the decision to give it to her had been planned long in advance, making their treatment of me even more calculated and cruel. With Marcus and Carmen on my side, I began developing a comprehensive plan to expose my parents' theft and hypocrisy. The plan had 3 phases: documentation, confrontation, and public revelation. The documentation phase was nearly complete. I had property records, trust fund, paperwork, bank account information, and witness testimony that would clearly demonstrate the pattern of financial abuse. The confrontation phase would involve recording my parents as I presented them with evidence of their theft and demanding an explanation for their actions. The public revelation phase would involve sharing the recording and documentation with every member of our extended family, ensuring that my parents' reputation for integrity and generosity would be permanently destroyed. But before I could execute my plan, I needed to prepare for the possibility that my parents would try to turn the rest of the family against me. I needed insurance leverage and a strategy for managing the inevitable fallout. That insurance would come from the most unexpected source imaginable. 2 weeks after my discovery, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown when I received a text message that changed everything. We need to talk. I have information about your parents that you need to hear. Elena Rodriguez. Elena Rodriguez was my high school guidance counselor who had stayed in touch with several students over the years, including me. She had always been a mentor figure who genuinely cared about her students' futures. The fact that she was reaching out unsolicited about my parents sent alarm bells through my head. I met Elena at her office the next afternoon, and what she told me made my blood boil with a fury I had never experienced before. Aurelia, I debated whether to share this information with you, but given what I have been hearing through the community grapevine, I think you deserve to know the truth. Elena began, her expression serious and concerned. What truth? 3 years ago your parents came to see me about college financial aid options. They told me you were struggling to pay for graduate school, and asked if there were any grants or scholarships available for continuing education students. This was news to me. My parents had never mentioned visiting my guidance counselor or exploring financial aid on my behalf. I spent several hours researching options and found 2 grants that you would have been perfect for. One for academic excellence, and another for students from middle-income families pursuing advanced degrees in education. My heart sank as I realized where this conversation was heading. I called your parents with the information and offered to help you complete the applications. The grants totaled nearly $30,000, which would have covered most of your tuition and living expenses. What did they say? Elena's face darkened. They told me not to mention the grants to you because they had already made arrangements to cover your expenses through family resources. They said they wanted to handle everything privately and did not want you to feel like you needed charity. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Elena, they never gave me any money for school. I have been working multiple jobs and accumulating debt this entire time. If they had told me about those grants, my financial situation would be completely different. Aurelia, that is not even the worst part, Elena continued grimly. 6 months later, I ran into your mother at the grocery store. She thanked me for helping connect Natasha with those educational grants, and mentioned how proud they were that Natasha was using the money to travel abroad and broaden her horizons. The room began to spin around me. Are you saying that my parents took grants that were intended for me and gave them to my sister instead? That is exactly what I am saying. And based on the application materials I saw, they forged your signature and used your academic records to qualify for funding that Natasha never would have been eligible for on her own. I sat in stunned silence as the full scope of my parents' betrayal became clear. They had not just stolen my inheritance, they had actively prevented me from receiving financial aid that could have changed my life, and then they had fraudulently obtained that same aid for my sister. Elena, would you be willing to provide written documentation of these conversations and the grant fraud? Absolutely. I have been disturbed by this situation for years, and I am relieved that you finally know the truth. Armed with Elena's evidence of grant fraud, I now had documentation of a pattern of financial abuse that went far beyond simple favoritism. My parents had systematically stolen from me while positioning themselves as generous benefactors to my sister. But I needed one more piece of evidence to make my case bulletproof. I decided to approach my parents directly but strategically. I called my mother and told her I wanted to have coffee to discuss my financial struggles and ask for advice about managing my student loan debt. Of course, sweetheart, she said sweetly. Your father and I are always here to help you figure things out. We met at their favorite cafe, a trendy spot where they often conducted business meetings and social conversations. I brought a small recording device which I kept in my purse but positioned to capture clear audio of our conversation. Mom, I have been thinking a lot about my financial situation since our dinner last week, I began carefully. I am wondering if there are family resources or inheritance funds that might be available to help with my education expenses. My mother's expression immediately became guarded. Aurelia, you know that your father and I have always been transparent about our financial limitations. We simply do not have the resources to support both you and your sister equally. I understand that, but I was specifically wondering about Grandma's estate. Did she leave any money specifically for education or major life expenses for the grandchildren? The color drained from my mother's face. She took a long sip of her coffee before responding, clearly buying time to formulate her answer. Your grandmother's estate was... complicated. There were debts and taxes that significantly reduced the inheritance. By the time everything was settled, there was not much left to distribute. But surely there was something, even a small amount that could help with tuition. Aurelia, your grandmother's will was very specific about how her assets should be used. The money that remained was designated for stable investments and long-term family security, not for individual expenses, like education. I leaned forward, maintaining eye contact. So the property you gave to Natasha, that came from your personal savings, not from Grandma's estate. My mother hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicions. Yes, of course. That property represents years of careful saving and investment on our part. We wanted to give Natasha a foundation for her future. And the grants that Elena Rodriguez mentioned, the educational funding that was available 3 years ago, my mother's face went completely white. She realized she had been caught in a web of lies and there was no graceful way to extract herself. I do not know what you are talking about, she said weakly. Mom Elena has documentation of her conversations with you and Dad about grants that were supposed to be for my education. She also has records showing that those same grants were later awarded to Natasha, using my academic credentials. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. My mother's hands were trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. Aurelia, you do not understand the full situation. Then explain it to me. Explain how you took my inheritance, stole my educational grants, and then acted like you were being generous by giving away money that was never yours to begin with. We were trying to protect the family's financial stability, she said desperately. Natasha has always been more responsible with money, and we thought she would make better use of the resources. So you decided that I did not deserve my own inheritance because you did not trust my financial judgment. That is not what we meant. What about Marcus? Does he know that his portion of the inheritance was used to buy Natasha's property? My mother's face crumpled. Marcus does not need to know about these family financial decisions. Actually, he already knows. I told him everything, and he is just as furious as I am about the fraud and theft. I stood up from the table, leaving my untouched coffee behind. Mom, you and Dad have 48 hours to figure out how you are going to make this right. You can either transfer the property to me as originally intended, or I am going to share this recording and all the documentation with every member of our family, and let them decide what kind of people you really are. My mother was crying as I walked away, but I felt no sympathy for her tears. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The countdown had begun, and justice was about to be served. 48 hours passed without a word from my parents. No phone calls, no text messages, no attempts at negotiation or explanation. Their silence told me everything I needed to know about their intentions. They were going to try to wait out my anger and hope I would eventually back down like I always had before. They had severely underestimated my resolve. On Saturday morning, I executed the final phase of my plan. I had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive presentation that included photocopies of all the legal documents, bank records, property transfers, grant applications, and recorded conversations. I had organized everything into a clear timeline that showed exactly how my parents had systematically stolen from their own children while maintaining a facade of loving generosity. My first stop was my Uncle David's house, where I knew the entire extended family was gathering for my cousin's birthday party. Perfect timing for maximum impact. I arrived with Marcus, who had flown in specifically to support me during this confrontation. We had coordinated our approach carefully. I would present the evidence while Marcus corroborated the details about his own stolen inheritance. When I walked into my uncle's living room carrying a thick folder of documents, the conversation immediately stopped. My parents were sitting on the couch looking relaxed and social, completely unaware that their world was about to implode. I need everyone's attention for a few minutes, I announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear. I have some important family business to discuss that affects all of us. My father's face immediately darkened. Aurelia, this is neither the time nor the place for whatever grievance you think you have. Actually, Dad, this is exactly the right time and place. Because what I have to share involves family money that was stolen from multiple people in this room. I began distributing copies of the documents to everyone present. My aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who had known my grandmother and remembered her promises about providing for her grandchildren's futures. 4 years ago, when Grandma died, she left a substantial trust fund specifically designated for her grandchildren's education and major life milestones. According to her will and the trust documentation, Marcus and I were each supposed to receive equal portions of that inheritance. I held up the property deed that showed how the downtown property had been purchased using trust fund money. Instead, my parents took control of the entire trust and used our inheritance money to buy a $450,000 property, which they then gave to my sister last week, as if it were their own generous gift. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as people examined the documents. My Aunt Rosa, who had already known about the situation, stood up to support my presentation. I can confirm that Mom explicitly told me about the trust fund and her intentions for the grandchildren's education, Rosa announced. She was very proud of her ability to provide opportunities for Aurelia, Marcus, and Natasha. Marcus stepped forward with his own documentation. I have bank records showing that my portion of the inheritance was approximately $150,000. That money was supposed to help me buy my first home and start my career without crushing debt. My mother tried to interrupt. This is all a misunderstanding. The estate was much more complicated than you children realize. Mom, please stop lying, I said, firmly pulling out my phone. Because I have you on recording admitting that Grandma's money was used for family investments, and I also have evidence of the educational grant fraud. I played the recording of our coffee shop conversation where my mother's voice clearly stated that grandmother's money had been used for stable investments and long-term family security, rather than individual education. Expenses. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. But I was not finished. I pulled out Elena Rodriguez's written statement about the educational grants. 3 years ago, my parents discovered grants worth $30,000 that I was eligible for based on my academic record. Instead of telling me about these opportunities, they applied for the grants using my credentials and gave the money to Natasha for travel and entertainment expenses. I distributed copies of the grant applications which clearly showed my academic information and forged signature being used to obtain funding that Natasha never would have qualified for on her own merit. My cousin Sarah, who worked as a bank manager, examined the financial documents with professional scrutiny. "This is textbook financial fraud," she announced. "Using someone else's identity to obtain grants, misappropriating trust fund money, and falsifying inheritance distributions are all serious crimes." My parents sat in stunned silence as the entire room turned to stare at them with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. The facade of respectability they had cultivated for decades was crumbling before their eyes. My Uncle David, who had always looked up to my father as the responsible older brother, shook his head in disbelief. "Richard, how could you steal from your own children? How could you lie to the entire family about Mom's estate?" "We were trying to make responsible financial decisions," my father said defensively. "Aurelia has always been impractical with money, and we thought Natasha would be a better steward of the family resources. So you decided that gave you the right to steal my inheritance and give it to your favorite daughter," I responded. "You decided that I did not deserve the education funding that my own grandmother specifically set aside for me." Natasha, who had been conspicuously silent during the entire presentation, finally spoke up. "I did not know the property came from Grandma's trust fund. Mom and Dad told me it was their savings. But you did know about the grants, did you not?" Marcus asked pointedly. "You knew that money was supposed to be for Aurelia's education." Natasha's face flushed red. I thought there had been some kind of mix-up with the applications. A mix-up that resulted in you receiving $30,000 that was never intended for you while your sister struggled to pay for school and accumulated debt." The room was filled with uncomfortable shifting and whispered conversations as everyone processed the full scope of the betrayal. My parents had not just stolen from me, they had manipulated the entire family's understanding of their financial situation and my grandmother's legacy. My Aunt Carmen stood up with tears in her eyes. Mom would be absolutely heartbroken if she knew what you did with her money. She worked so hard to make sure her grandchildren would have opportunities she never had. And instead, you used her generosity to play favorites with your own children, while lying to everyone about your motivations, added my Uncle David. I looked directly at my parents, who were now isolated on their couch, while the rest of the family formed a circle of judgment around them. You have a choice to make right now, I said clearly. You can transfer the downtown property to me, as originally intended by Grandma's will, return Marcus's portion of the inheritance, and publicly acknowledge your theft and fraud. Or I can take all this evidence to the police and let them decide how to handle the criminal aspects of what you have done. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone waited for my parents' response. My father's face had turned an alarming shade of purple as he processed the ultimatum I had just delivered. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, he sat frozen on the couch while the entire extended family stared at him expectantly. You are trying to destroy this family over money, he finally said, his voice shaking with rage and desperation. You are willing to tear apart decades of relationships because you feel entitled to something that was never guaranteed to you. Dad, I am not destroying anything. You destroyed this family the moment you decided to steal from your own children and lie about it for years. My mother suddenly burst into tears, but they felt performative rather than genuine. Aurelia, you do not understand the financial pressure we have been under. We made the best decisions we could with the resources available. The resources available, Marcus stepped forward, his voice dripping with incredulity. You mean the resources you stole from us, the money our grandmother specifically designated for our futures? Aunt Rosa stood up, her face flushed with anger. Patricia, I cannot believe you are still trying to justify this theft. You looked me in the eye for 4 years and lied about what happened to Mom's money. We never lied, my father protested weakly. We simply made executive decisions about family finances that were in everyone's best interests. Uncle David laughed bitterly. Executive decisions, Richard. You are not the CEO of this family. You were the executor of Mom's estate, which means you had a legal obligation to follow her wishes, not substitute your own judgment. The room erupted into arguments as different family members began expressing their outrage and disappointment. My cousins were furious that their inheritance had been stolen. My aunts and uncles were appalled by the systematic deception. Even family friends were shaking their heads in disgust at the betrayal they had witnessed. But Natasha's reaction was the most telling of all. Instead of defending our parents or expressing remorse about benefiting from stolen money, she became defensive and entitled. Everyone is acting like I committed some terrible crime, she said loudly, trying to speak over the family arguments. I received a gift from my parents, and now everyone wants to punish me for their generosity. Natasha, that gift was bought with money that belonged to your sister and cousin Carmen, explained patiently. Do you not see the ethical problem with that? I did not steal anything from anyone? Aurelia is just jealous that Mom and Dad chose to invest in my future instead of enabling her poor financial decisions. The casual cruelty of that statement silenced the entire room. Even our parents looked shocked by Natasha's lack of empathy or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Poor financial decisions, I repeated slowly. You mean like working multiple jobs to pay for graduate school while you lived in our parents' basement for 3 years after college? You chose to pursue expensive education that may never provide a return on investment. I chose to be practical and focus on building relationships and life skills. Marcus stepped between us before I could respond to that ridiculous statement. Natasha, your sister has a master's degree and 2 professional certifications. You have been unemployed for 6 months and spent last week posting Instagram photos from a spa retreat. What life skills are you referring to exactly? The conversation was spiraling into personal attacks, which was exactly what I had hoped to avoid. I needed to regain control and focus on the concrete actions my parents needed to take. This is not about Natasha, I announced loudly enough to cut through the family drama. This is about Mom and Dad's choices and their willingness to make things right. I turned back to my parents, who were now huddled together on the couch, looking like defendants in a criminal trial. I am going to ask you one more time. Are you willing to transfer the property to me and return Marcus's portion of the inheritance? Or do I need to file criminal charges for fraud and theft? My mother looked at my father desperately, clearly hoping he would find some way to salvage the situation. But he just sat there staring at the floor, apparently unable to process that his decades of financial manipulation had finally been exposed. We need time to think about this, my mother said finally. You have had 4 years to think about this, Marcus replied coldly. 4 years to do the right thing voluntarily. Time is up. Uncle David stepped forward with an expression I had never seen before, cold disappointment mixed with disgust. Richard, I am going to make this very simple for you. You have 72 hours to transfer that property to Aurelia and make Marcus whole for his stolen inheritance. If you do not do that voluntarily, I will personally drive them to the police station and the district attorney's office to file formal charges. You would really turn your own brother in to the police over family money? My father asked incredulously. I would turn anyone in to the police for stealing from children and lying about it for years, David replied without hesitation. Family relationship does not give you a license to commit crimes. The birthday party that was supposed to be a celebration had become a family tribunal, and my parents were losing badly. As people began to pack up their belongings and prepare to leave, it became clear that their social standing in the family had been permanently destroyed. But the real consequences were just beginning. Over the next 48 hours, word of the confrontation spread throughout our social circle like wildfire. My parents' friends, neighbors, and professional contacts all heard different versions of the story about their financial fraud and theft from their own children. My father's employer received an anonymous tip about his involvement in grant fraud, which triggered an internal investigation into his handling of company finances. My mother's volunteer organizations quietly asked her to step back from leadership roles after donors expressed concern about financial oversight and ethical standards. Natasha found herself socially isolated as friends and acquaintances questioned whether she had been complicit in the theft or was simply a willfully ignorant beneficiary of stolen money. The family's reputation for integrity and generosity, carefully cultivated over decades, evaporated in a matter of days. But the most satisfying consequence was yet to come. 71 hours after my ultimatum, I received a phone call from my father's attorney. Miss Martinez, I am calling on behalf of your parents to inform you that they are prepared to transfer the downtown property to your name and provide financial compensation to your cousin Marcus for his portion of the inheritance. I had expected them to cave, but hearing the formal surrender still felt surreal after years of financial manipulation and gaslighting. What are the specific terms of the transfer? I asked, making sure to get everything documented properly. The property deed will be transferred to you free and clear with all associated costs covered by your parents. Marcus will receive $150,000, which represents his portion of your grandmother's trust fund, plus interest accumulated over the 4 years since your grandmother's death. And what about the educational grants that were fraudulently obtained using my credentials? The attorney cleared his throat uncomfortably. Your parents have agreed to reimburse you for the $30,000 in grants that were improperly awarded to your sister. Additionally, they will cover your remaining student loan debt, which I understand totals approximately $40,000. I almost dropped the phone. Not only were they returning the stolen inheritance, but they were also compensating me for the educational funding I had been denied and the debt I had accumulated as a result of their fraud. Is there anything they want in return for this financial restitution? They are requesting that you agree not to file criminal charges and that you keep the details of this arrangement private within the family. I laughed out loud. They want me to keep quiet about their crimes after they spent 4 years lying to everyone about their generosity and my financial irresponsibility. That is their preference, yes. Here is my counteroffer, I said firmly. I will accept the property transfer and financial restitution, and I will not file criminal charges. But I will not agree to keep their fraud secret. The family deserves to know the truth about what happened, and I deserve to have my reputation cleared after years of being portrayed as financially irresponsible. The attorney agreed to present my terms, and by the end of the week, all the paperwork was finalized. The downtown property was transferred to my name, making me the owner of a beautiful 3-bedroom townhouse in the most desirable neighborhood in the city. Marcus received his inheritance money plus interest, which allowed him to finally purchase his first home and start the investment portfolio he had been planning for years. My student loans were paid off completely, and I received additional compensation that covered my living expenses while I finished graduate school. But more importantly than the financial vindication was the restoration of my standing within the family and community. Uncle David made sure that everyone understood exactly what had happened and how my parents had manipulated the truth for years. The family members who had previously viewed me as financially irresponsible now understood that I had been systematically denied resources that could have changed my entire educational and career trajectory. Elena Rodriguez wrote a formal letter documenting the grant fraud and submitted it to the appropriate authorities, ensuring that my academic record was cleared of any suspicion of impropriety. My extended family rallied around Marcus and me, offering emotional support and practical assistance as we rebuilt our financial lives with the resources that had always been rightfully ours. The most unexpected outcome was how the crisis strengthened my relationships with family members who proved their integrity under pressure. Aunt Rosa became a trusted mentor who helped me navigate real estate ownership and investment strategies. Uncle David and I developed a much closer relationship based on mutual respect and shared values about honesty and justice. Marcus and I emerged from the experience as true allies with an unbreakable bond forged through adversity and mutual support. But what about my parents and Natasha? They became increasingly isolated within the family as people struggled to trust them after witnessing their capacity for deception and manipulation. Social invitations became rare, and family gatherings felt awkward and strained whenever they attended. My father's professional reputation suffered significantly after the investigation into his financial practices, though he managed to avoid criminal charges. My mother's volunteer work dried up as organizations distanced themselves from the scandal. Natasha eventually moved out of state, claiming she needed a fresh start away from family drama. But I suspect she simply could not handle the social consequences of benefiting from stolen money while maintaining she had done nothing wrong. Do I feel guilty about the destruction of their social standing? Absolutely not. They created this situation through years of deliberate choices to steal, lie, and manipulate. The consequences they faced were entirely self-inflicted. 6 months later, I am living in my beautiful downtown property, which I have transformed into both my home and my office space for the educational consulting business I started with the financial stability my inheritance provided. Marcus bought a lovely house in Portland and started the tech company he had been dreaming about for years. He sends me photos of his progress, renovating the property and building his business with the resources our grandmother intended him to have. We talk regularly about our grandmother and how proud she would be to see us thriving with the opportunities and generosity that are possible. The experience taught me that family loyalty should never require tolerating abuse, theft, or systematic deception. Real family members support each other's success rather than undermining it personally. It also taught me that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes the truth takes years to emerge, but when it does, the vindication can be sweeter than any revenge. Looking back, I am grateful for every step of this journey, even the painful parts. The financial restitution changed my life, but the personal growth and strengthened relationships were even more valuable. My grandmother's legacy lived on exactly as she intended, providing opportunities for her grandchildren to build better futures. The only difference was that it took 4 years and a family confrontation to honor her wishes properly. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered that family members were lying about money or inheritance? How do you think families should handle financial disputes when trust has been broken? And most importantly, do you think my parents got the justice they deserved, or should there have been more serious consequences for their actions? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story of family karma resonated with you, Please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama and justice-served moments. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes standing up to family betrayal is not just justified, it is necessary. Thank you for watching, and remember that your worth is never determined by how others choose to treat you. Sometimes the family you choose is more valuable than the family you were born into, and there is no shame in demanding the respect and honesty you deserve. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth and never let anyone convince you to accept less than you are worth.